If you're up late with me, pull up a chair and stay to the end, then tell me where you're listening from. I like knowing which porches and bedrooms these stories find. The first insult wasn't loud. It came wrapped in a smile and a name tag. "Kitchen," the sticker said, slapped on my sweater like a warning label. I'd signed up to greet at the door. Shake hands, pour coffee, be seen. But Mark Ellison, my son-in-law, with the contractor grin and the shiny belt buckle, pressed a bottle of bleach into my hand and nodded toward the church basement sink. "Best to keep busy, Rachel. Plates are piling up." That's how a person disappears in my town. Not with a shout, with a chore. I took the bleach. "What else do you do when half the congregation is watching?" Pastor Jim clapped Mark on the shoulder like he'd wrestled the roof onto the sanctuary with his bare hands. Applause rolled over the folding tables and the green bean casseroles like a storm front. Nobody blinked. The lights hummed the way cheap fluorescents always do, making everyone look a shade paler than they admit to. The coffee tasted like it had been punished for something. There was a Walmart cake, bleeding blue frosting letters into white building fund, like a plea and a scold in one breath. I stood at the sink and swallowed my pride like spoiled milk. It sat heavy. I used to think they cared. I really did. But maybe they only care about being seen caring. A hand brushed my elbow. "Miss Carol, treasurer." Since Jimmy Carter, spine like a ruler, slid something under my palm without looking up. Carbon copy paper. The kind that leaves ink on your fingers and truth on your tongue. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. I tucked it into my apron pocket and kept scrubbing. Plates, forks, the shame off my face. "Let's thank Mark for managing repairs," Pastor Jim said into the mic. Applause again. Longer this time. I watched Mark soak in it, chin-up eyes half closed like a man catching good weather. My husband Harold would have snorted. He used to say, "Numbers don't lie, Rachel. People do." Then he'd thumb the corner of his ledger, the leather one with the worn edge, where his hand rested every job and nail and late payment lined up like fence posts. I didn't know it yet, but that ledger was about to become more than a book. It was going to be the match. Right then, though, I was just a woman with pruny fingers and a pocketed scrap of proof I hadn't read. "Ms. Whitaker," a voice behind me, young and careful. Noah, 17, too much hair for Coach Donnelly. Busboy at the Maple Street Diner. Good kid who smells like fryer oil and kindness. He held out his hands for the rag. "I've got dish duty. You greet. Folks like seeing you first. Don't tell me small mercies can't keep a person upright." That one did. I pressed the rag into his hands and walked back to the door. Smile on. Shoulders square. The kind of posture that says I'm fine when you're not. As people filed past, my thumb rubbed circles over the folded carbon in my pocket, and something mean and bright in me whispered, "This doesn't add up." It started to rain. The kind that makes parking lots smell like pennies. Through the open basement door, I watched my old F-150 sitting where I'd left her, paint dull, reliable as sunrise. She's older than my daughter's marriage and twice as dependable. Mark drifted through the room like he owned the deed. He leaned too close to the choir director, hand on the back of her chair, eyes flicking without landing. He's always been careful about angles, like the whole town is a camera and he's directing it. On my second pass, with the donation jar, Miss Carol's voice cut the room clean in two. "Before we leave, she said we'll be reimbursing Rachel for covering the electric during the cold snap." Church would have been dark without her. A few heads turned like someone had opened a window. Mark's smile tightened at the edges. Only a little, like a shirt tugged from the wrong drawer. I saw it. Small reversal. Small, but it held. After cleanup, I walked the donation jar back to the table and finally unfolded what Miss Carol had given me. The paper was warm from my pocket. Whitaker Electrical Roof Repairs, $12,840. A signature that wasn't Pastor Jim's. A P.O. box I didn't recognize. I felt the floor tilt, not with shock, but with recognition. Harold's invoices never used that font. The template was ours, but wrong in the bones the way a counterfeit smile is wrong. The receipt number sat one off from the last one Harold ever wrote before he died. You only know that kind of thing if you've washed invoices alongside dinner plates for 25 years. Paper tells on people. My mama said that. I thought she meant grocery lists and apologies. Turns out she meant everything. Everything all right, Rachel? Mark again. Close enough I could smell his aftershave, the expensive kind that tries too hard. Fine, I said, because rage is a hot pan. You have to let the handle cool before you move it. He squeezed my elbow like he was checking for ripeness. We moved the council meeting to Tuesday. Smaller group. More efficient. More efficient is what men in charge say when they mean fewer witnesses. I didn't answer. I watched his reflection in the fellowship hall window instead. In glass, the shine drops a notch. You see the seams. On my way out, Deputy Nate Holloway stood by the door with a styrofoam cup and a face that says, "I'll wait as long as it takes." Nate never asks questions. He leaves space for answers to wander in. "Evening, Miss Whitaker." "Evening." He looked past me into the buzzing room. "My mama says you kept her space heater running. Wouldn't take a dime." He tipped the cup almost a salute. "For what it's worth, weird mail's been turning up at the P.O. boxes lately. If you see anything that smells wrong, bring it by." "Paper tells on people," I finished. He smiled small and knowing. "Yes, ma'am." I drove home, slow wipers squeaking on a windshield I keep promising to replace. The ledger sat high on the top shelf in the hallway where I can reach it if I stand on my toes. I made tea the way Harold liked it, strong enough to argue back, and set the ledger on the kitchen table next to the carbon copy, like a meeting I didn't schedule but needed to attend. I didn't open it yet. I just rested my hand on the leather and listened to the house breathe. Grief changes a house. It settles into the corners, grows quiet and heavy like snow. If they only knew who you were, I told Harold in my head. If they only knew who I still am. I pulled my spiral notebook, the cheap one from the drugstore with the red cover, and wrote a line across the top of a fresh page. They gave me bleach instead of a seat. Under it, I wrote the P.O. box number. The date, the amount. Because I've learned something important, the world won't hand you dignity. You have to write it down, line by line, until it becomes fact. Before I turned out the lamp, I remembered a sliver of paper that slid out of my daughter's tote last month when I was helping her clean out her trunk. Mark's tidy handwriting, a list that looked like hardware, and a P.O. box scribbled in the corner. I picked it up, thought nothing of it, tucked it back. Funny the way memory circles back when it smells smoke. I don't know if you've ever felt a truth wake up inside you. It's quiet at first, a shift. Then it stretches, puts both feet on the floor, and looks around your life like it's been living there all along. That's how it started. Not with shouting, not with a scene, with a sticker on my sweater, a carbon copy in my pocket, and a boy who decided the widow deserved the door. Stay with me. The pulpit's coming, and so is the match. And when you're ready, tell me where you're listening from. I like seeing how far a small town story can travel when someone finally tells it straight. If you've ever been made to feel like you imagined it all, this part might sound familiar. Stay with me, and when we're done, tell me if you've lived through something like it. Sometimes the only thing that makes the weight lighter is knowing someone else carried it too. The Monday after the church supper, I walked into Whitaker's Hardware for nails and paint thinner, and the bell above the door jangled like it always did. Same shelves Harold and I had stocked 20 years ago, back before Home Depot came in and started hollowing out the town. "Morning, Rachel," Mr. Grady said from behind the counter, not looking up from his ledger. Funny how ledger is just another word until you're the one who knows it can make or break a man. I wanted to ask him about that receipt, but I didn't. Small towns run on fuel you can't see. Rumors favors the right kind of silence. So I bought my paint thinner and kept the paper folded in my purse the way a woman might keep a secret letter. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with Harold's ledger and my red spiral notebook, open side by side. The house was too quiet. You ever notice how a house with just one person in it hums different, like it's holding its breath? I copied the numbers from Miss Carroll's carbon copy onto the first page of my notebook. Whitaker Electrical, roof repairs, $12,840. P.O. Box 317. Then I wrote the date. The handwriting looked different from Harold's tight, blocky script, but still neat. Mine has always leaned a little to the left like it's tired. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Proof, maybe, or courage. Sometimes they're the same. By Wednesday, whispers had already reached me. At the grocery store, Mrs. Lyons from choir leaned across her cart and said, "Rachel, honey, you've been looking preoccupied. Everything all right?" Preoccupied. That's church lady for suspicious. I smiled the way women learn to warm enough to deflect closed enough to end it. "Just tired," I said, and moved on to the potatoes. Behind me, I heard her say to another woman, "Poor thing, she's not been herself since Harold passed." Wanders writes things down. They think grief makes you unreliable. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it makes you sharper than you've ever been. I went home and wrote her words in my notebook under the receipt. Not out of spite, out of habit, because I wanted a record of everything, even the cuts you can't show a doctor. The days blurred into a pattern work at the library in the mornings, home by noon ledger on the table, by one tea steaming in the chipped blue mug Harold bought me at a flea market. I'd flip through pages comparing his last months of invoices with the new numbers popping up at church, and I started to see the pattern. Mark was clever. I'll give him that. He didn't forge whole invoices. He reused the old templates Harold had left on the office computer. Changed a number here, a date there. Just enough to look real if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention. I knew Harold's handwriting like I knew the sound of his boots on the porch. And this was a counterfeit smile dressed up as truth. 2 weeks later, Pastor Jim called me after supper. "Rachel, I've heard you've been asking questions about the building fund. I just want to remind you we're blessed to have Mark handling things. He's a gift to this community." His voice was syrupy, but the kind that leaves a film on your tongue. "I'm just curious," I said softly. "Receipts don't match." There was a pause on the line. Then he chuckled. "You've been through so much. Maybe let others carry the load now. Don't weigh yourself down." That was the moment I realized it wasn't just Mark. It was the whole web of men who liked him standing tall because they liked me bowed low. I hung up, wrote every word in my notebook, and underlined it twice. The isolation was the worst part. Even my daughter Emily brushed me off when I hinted. "Mom, you're imagining things," she said one evening when I stopped by her place. "Mark's been nothing but good to this family." Her kitchen smelled like vanilla candles and takeout pizza. She looked tired hair pulled back in a rushed ponytail. "He moved the council meetings without notice," I told her. "That's not transparency." Emily sighed, fiddling with her phone. "He said the smaller group was more efficient." "You've always been skeptical, Mom. Maybe you just don't like him." I wanted to scream. But instead, I nodded, kissed her on the forehead like she was still 5, and went home. That night, I wrote, "Even Emily doesn't believe me. Must keep gathering proof." Sometimes the only ally you have is the page you're writing on. It wasn't all whispers and shut doors. A few cracks of light slipped through. Noah, the diner kid, came by one afternoon with a box of canned goods from his grandma. "She said you've done plenty for others, so let someone do for you." He mumbled eyes on his shoes. When I thanked him, he looked up and said, "Folks think you're nosy. I think you're brave." I wrote that down too, because you have to collect hope the same way you collect evidence piece by piece. By the 3rd week, I had a stack of notes amounts that didn't match receipts with forged signatures, checks endorsed in handwriting too smooth to be Pastor Jim's. And then came the twist of the knife. Miss Carroll stopped me in the post office lobby, where the floor smells like floor wax and old envelopes. She lowered her voice. "Box 317. That's not church property. That's registered to Mark Ellison personally." Her eyes were hard, but her hand trembled when she passed me a slip of paper with the registration info scribbled down. I wanted to hug her. Instead, I nodded and slipped it into my purse with the rest. My notebook was starting to look like a trial waiting for its judge. Of course, secrets have a way of fighting back. At the next council meeting, Mark looked right at me across the table and said, "Rachel, do you even understand these numbers? It's complicated. I don't expect you to." The men chuckled. Quiet, polite. The way men chuckle when they want you to feel small. I smiled, slid my notebook closed, and let them believe I was shrinking. All the while, I could feel the carbon copies in my purse pressing against my side like a weapon waiting its turn. That night, I sat at Harold's desk, the lamp buzzing low. I opened his ledger and set my notebook beside it. For the first time, I didn't cry over his empty chair. I felt steady. "Harold?" I whispered, "They think I'm weak. They think I'm losing my mind." I rested my palm on the worn leather of his ledger. "But paper tells on people, and when it does, I'll be ready." That's how the silent struggle went. Days of being dismissed, whispered about, told I was tired, confused, stuck in the past. Nights of writing it all down, page after page, until the truth couldn't be ignored anymore. I didn't have allies in every corner. But I had enough: the boy who took the rag, the treasurer who slipped me receipts, the memory of a husband who taught me that numbers don't lie. And I had patience. That was the one thing Mark Ellison didn't count on. He thought humiliation would keep me quiet, but it only sharpened my pencil. Stick around! Because the day would come when I carried that red notebook right into the pulpit and opened it in front of God and everybody. And when I did, the same hands that clapped for Mark would be clapping for me. Now, before we step into that storm, tell me where you're listening from tonight. I want to know who's out there in the quiet with me. If you've been doubted long enough, there comes a day when silence just won't hold anymore. That Sunday was mine. It started like any other service. Hymns sung half-heartedly, bulletins printed on that thin paper that tears if you fold it wrong. The smell of coffee strong enough to make your eyes water, kids whispering in the back pews, Pastor Jim's voice droning through announcements. And then Mark, standing tall at the pulpit in his pressed jacket, the spotlight of the stained glass windows catching just right on his shoulders. He had that easy smile plastered on the one that always fooled people who didn't know better. "Friends," he began, hands spread wide like a politician, "I'm proud to report the building fund is strong. Repairs are underway, and by God's grace, we're on budget." Applause trickled, polite but steady. Folks wanted to believe him. People always want to believe the man who promises everything's fine. I sat in the second row, my notebook heavy in my lap, Harold's old ledger tucked neatly beside it. My palms were damp, my heartbeat steady, but fast like a drum warming up before the march. When the clapping died, Pastor Jim smiled. "Let's thank Mark for his leadership." That was the moment I stood up. My knees shook, but my voice didn't. "Pastor, if I may," I said. Heads turned. You could hear the scrape of a chair leg against the floor, the intake of breath from people already uncomfortable. Mark's smile faltered just a fraction before snapping back into place. "Of course," Rachel, Pastor Jim said gently, though his eyes told me to sit down. But I didn't. I walked to the front, notebook in hand ledger tucked under my arm. My heels clicked against the tile floor, each step echoing like a verdict. When I reached the pulpit, I turned and faced them all, the choir, the congregation, the men on the council. My daughter Emily, sitting stiff in the third pew, eyes wide. And I opened Harold's ledger. "My husband kept records," I began. My voice carried farther than I expected, steady, clear. "Every job, every nail, every cent. He believed numbers don't lie." I lifted my red notebook. "And for the past month, I've been keeping my own. Because something about these building fund receipts didn't add up." A murmur rippled through the room. Mark cleared his throat, laugh practiced and easy. "Rachel, I think you're mistaken." I cut him off, flipping a page. "On March 12th, A payment of $12,840 was submitted to Whitaker Electrical for roof repairs. I held up the carbon copy Miss Carroll had slipped me. But Whitaker Electrical hasn't operated since Harold passed. There were no such repairs. And the P.O. box listed on this receipt I held the slip higher is registered to Mark Ellison. The room went still. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, the shuffling of someone's shoe against the floor. Rachel Pastor Jim began voice, "Careful, surely there's an explanation." "There is." I dropped the next page open. Receipts altered. Signatures forged. Checks deposited into accounts that don't belong to this church. For weeks I've been documenting everything. Dates, amounts, copies. I turned to face Mark. "You've been stealing from the very people who trusted you." His mask cracked then. Not all at once, but enough. The polite smile faded into something sharp. "You don't understand finances," he snapped. "These are complicated transactions." "Numbers don't lie," I said softly, letting Harold's words fill the space. "But men do." Gasps rose. Emily covered her mouth with her hand. And then came the twist. From the back pew, a camera clicked. Not a phone, but a real camera, old-fashioned, with a flash that cut through the dim sanctuary. Heads turned. "I'd invited someone." "Folks, this is Jenna from the County Herald," I said. "She's been looking into building fund irregularities across the county. I thought she might want to hear our story." Every head swiveled toward her. And Mark's face. Oh, his face. Red, mottled eyes darting like a man trapped. "You set me up," he hissed. I smiled, calm, almost gentle. "No, you set yourself up. I just opened the curtain." The next few minutes blurred, but some images will never leave me. Mark slamming his hand on the pulpit, voice rising. "This is slander. You'll regret this." Gasps from the crowd. Miss Carroll standing, arms crossed, voice steady. I gave her those receipts because I knew. "And I wasn't going to let you drag this church down." Deputy Nate, who'd been sitting near the aisle, standing tall. "Mr. Ellison, I'll need you to come with me for questioning." The sanctuary erupted, half in outrage, half in disbelief. People who'd clapped for him minutes ago now whispering, shifting, unable to meet his eye. And through it all, I stayed standing. Ledger in one hand, notebook in the other, heart pounding, but steady. Emily stared at me, betrayal and relief warring on her face. She whispered, barely audible, "Mom." But I couldn't stop. Not yet. "Mark Ellison has been praised for months as the man saving this church," I said, voice rising over the noise. But it was a lie. He's been stealing from the very people who trusted him. While I was handed bleach and told to keep busy, I was also handed the truth. And the truth will always win. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was recognition. Mark tried one last time, his voice desperate, cracking. "Rachel, if you say you love your daughter, you'll stop this. Think of Emily. Think of what this will do to her marriage." That was the dagger he didn't know he'd pulled. Because Emily stood then. Stood, tall eyes brimming with tears, but steady. "She deserves the truth, Mark," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "And so do I." The final nail. Deputy Nate moved forward, hand on his belt. Mark cursed loud enough to echo before storming down the aisle. The doors swung open, the spring groaning. He vanished into daylight, but the shadow he left behind stayed thick in the room. I turned back to the congregation. My hands shook now, the adrenaline wearing thin, but my voice didn't waver. "This isn't about me," I said. "It's about trust, and about never letting anyone write you out of your own story." Then I closed the ledger, pressed it to my chest, and walked back down the aisle. The applause came slowly, hesitant at first, then swelling like a wave, but I didn't need it. I already had what I came for. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again. The ledger and notebook side by side, just like before. But this time, something felt different. The house didn't hum with silence. It breathed. I wrote one final line in red ink across the page, "Today I was seen." And that's how the breaking point came. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with truth spoken out loud when everyone wanted it quiet. Stay with me, because the fallout was just as sharp and some apologies came far too late. But before I tell you about that, tell me where you're listening from tonight. It helps me picture who's out there in the quiet walking this road with me. If you've ever dropped a stone in a pond, you know the ripples don't stop at the first circle. They travel out, bumping into things you never meant to touch. That Sunday morning at the pulpit was my stone. And the ripples came fast. By Monday, everyone in town had an opinion. Some whispered it at the post office while licking stamps like their tongues weren't itching with gossip. Some said it straight to my face in the frozen food aisle like they'd known all along. And some just looked away when I walked into the Maple Street diner, as if shame might be contagious. Small towns don't handle scandal with silence. They handle it with repetition, telling the same story, until it grows legs, then wings. And now, my name was woven into every version. Did you hear Rachel Whitaker stood up in church? She brought a reporter, for God's sake. Bless her heart, but she's probably lost her mind since Harold died. That last one cut. But I wrote it down in my red notebook because paper tells on people too. Emily came to me 2 days later. She didn't knock. Just pushed the door open and stood in the kitchen doorway, pale, hollow-eyed, like someone who hadn't slept since Sunday. "Mom," she started, then stopped. She looked younger than she had in years, all her practiced confidence stripped away. I poured her tea, slid it across the table. She stared at the steam for a long while before whispering, "I didn't know. I wanted to be angry." Part of me wanted to shout, "How could you not?" But when it's your child sitting across from you, broken and betrayed, the anger melts into something softer. "I know," I said gently. Tears slid down her cheeks. "He told me you hated him, that you were jealous because I moved on after Dad. I believed him." I reached across, took her hand. "He wanted you to. That's how men like him work." We sat there for a long time, hand in hand, steam curling between us like forgiveness trying to take shape. By the end of the week, Deputy Nate stopped by. Not in uniform, just in jeans and a jacket that smelled faintly of wood smoke. "Charges are moving forward," he told me. "Fraud, embezzlement, forgery. More may come once the county digs through the rest." He hesitated at the door. "You should know, Rachel, what you did took guts. Most folks would have let it slide. Pretended not to notice." I shrugged. Most folks didn't have Harold's ledger reminding them every day that numbers don't lie. He smiled slow and steady. "Well, you've got half this county looking at their own books now. Guess you started something." When he left, I wrote that down too. Not for evidence, just as proof that one act of truth can ripple farther than you ever meant it to. Of course not. Everyone came with thanks. At the grocery store, Pastor Jim cornered me between the canned beans and the soup. His smile was tight eyes, darting like a man who'd lost control of his flock. "You embarrassed this church, Rachel," he whispered. Could have handled it quietly. I raised an eyebrow. Quietly, like at one of those small, efficient meetings, Mark moved into his back pocket. His face flushed. "The Lord values forgiveness. The Lord also values truth," I said evenly. "And maybe you should consider who you've been forgiving, Pastor." I left him there among the beans. Some apologies come late. Some never come at all. The rebuilding part came slowly, like spring after a hard winter. Miss Carroll asked me to join the finance committee, the same one Mark had tried to lock me out of. "We need eyes that don't blink," she said. I laughed, bitter at first, then softer. "Careful, Carol. You'll have me running this place." "Maybe it's about time," she replied, not smiling. And just like that, the widow with bleach in her hands became the woman with a seat at the table. The first meeting I walked into, heads turned. A few scowls, a few nods. But nobody handed me a rag. They handed me the balance sheet, and I didn't shrink. At home, I began rewriting my notebook. turning scraps of evidence into something bigger, essays, stories, reflections. Not just about Mark, but about dignity, about how easily women get erased until they write themselves back in. I wrote about bleach bottles and carbon copies, about how humiliation is just the prelude to truth if you keep your pen steady. No one asked me to share them. But words have a way of finding their own audience. Before long, Miss Carroll slipped one to her niece, who slipped it to a women's group in Springfield, and suddenly I had invitations to speak at little gatherings, church basements, community centers, places that smelled of coffee and folding chairs. I'd stand there, hands shaking, voice steady, and tell them, don't wait for permission to be heard. Write it down, line by line. That's how you take back your story. And every time women nodded like they'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Mark's trial came quicker than I expected. He sat there in his pressed suit, trying to paste that old smile back on, but the edges wouldn't stick. The evidence spoke louder than his charm ever could. The day the verdict came guilty on multiple counts, I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just went home, opened Harold's ledger, and wrote one word in my notebook beside it: justice. But maybe the real rebuilding wasn't about Mark at all. It was about Emily coming over on Sundays, no longer defended by lies, but sitting on my porch with coffee, letting the silence between us be comfortable again. It was about Noah stopping by with fresh eggs from his grandma's hens, telling me he'd decided to study accounting at community college because numbers don't lie, Ms. Whitaker. It was about the church once, so quick to clap for the wrong man, now clapping for the widow who wouldn't stay erased. One afternoon, I sat in my garden, the place Harold and I had planted years ago now, bursting with tomatoes and marigolds, and realized something. The ledger and the notebook weren't just records. They were anchors. One held Harold's past, one held my present. Together, they built a future where I wasn't invisible. For the first time in a long while, I breathed without heaviness. That's how the fallout went. Painful, messy, sometimes cruel. But out of it grew something steady, something no one could take from me. Not Mark, not whispers, not even time. And that's the thing about rebuilding. You don't always notice it while you're laying the bricks. You just keep stacking truth on top of truth until one day you look up and realize you've built something stronger than what they tried to tear down. Stay with me, because the final part isn't just about survival. It's about legacy, what you pass on and what outlives the whispers. But before we turn the page, tell me, has there ever been a time someone underestimated you and you proved them wrong without even raising your voice? I'd love to hear your story too. You know, people always think the ending of a story is the verdict, or the day the guilty man gets walked out in cuffs. But endings are quieter than that. They sneak up on you in the middle of ordinary life, in the sound of a coffee cup on the porch rail, or a laugh you didn't think you'd hear again. It's been a year since that Sunday morning when I carried Harold's ledger into the pulpit. A year since the whispers turned to stares, since the mask fell off the man my daughter thought she knew. A year since I stopped being the woman with a rag in her hand and became the woman with a record in her lap. When people see me now, they don't look away. Some still lower their voices, sure, but most of them nod, sometimes with shame, sometimes with respect. Funny thing is, I don't need either anymore. Respect feels nice, but I learned I could live without it. Shame, on the other hand, has a way of boomeranging back to the people who tried to hand it to you. Emily sits with me most Sundays now. Not in that old pew, she hasn't been back to the church much, and I don't blame her. We sit on the porch swing Harold built out of oak planks, sip sweet tea, and let the cicadas fill the silence. She's healing in her own way. Her divorce papers are filed, her voice stronger with every story she shares at those women's groups she started leading. She still struggles with guilt, but I remind her often guilt belongs to the man who betrayed you, not the woman who trusted him. I tell her what I had to tell myself too. Survival is not weakness. It's the strongest thing we'll ever do. And then there's my notebook. Remember that red spiral one I started when folks thought grief was making me see shadows? It's filled cover to cover now. Every receipt, every whispered word, every note of betrayal. But also every kindness, every egg from Noah's grandma's hens, every tear Emily shed at my kitchen table, every clap in a church basement when women heard me speak and felt less alone. I thought about putting it away when Mark's trial ended, but instead, I bought another. This one leather-bound with pages thick enough to carry the weight of new truths. Because legacy isn't just what you leave behind, it's what you keep writing while you're still here. Mark. He's serving his sentence upstate. I don't think about him often, but sometimes when I catch a headline about fraud or betrayal, I wonder if he sits in that cell and replays the moment the ledger closed on him. Not the police sirens, not the trial, not the verdict. Just me standing there in that sanctuary ledger in one hand, notebook in the other, saying the words that turned his applause into silence. That was the day he lost more than his freedom. He lost the story he'd written for himself. And maybe that's the harshest sentence of all. Because when you've spent your life convincing people you're the hero, and suddenly they see you as the villain, there's no mask big enough to hide behind. I didn't need to destroy him. He did that himself. All I did was open the curtain. And that's the lesson I want my granddaughter Lily to know. She's only 12, but she already asks questions. Grandma, why do you write everything down? Why do you keep old papers? I told her the truth, because honey paper remembers what people want to forget. One day when she's older, I'll hand her those notebooks. I want her to see that her grandmother wasn't just a woman with gray hair and garden dirt under her nails. I was a woman who stood up when no one else would. I was a woman who wrote the truth until it couldn't be ignored. That's my legacy. Not the scandal, not the trial, not even the justice. My legacy is that one day when someone tries to erase her, she'll know she comes from women who don't stay erased. And let me tell you that knowledge, it's worth more than any verdict. I've been asked to speak at the high school graduation this year. The principal said the kids could use a reminder about honesty and resilience. Me, the same woman they once whispered about in the grocery store, now invited to the stage. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror last night practicing. And you know what I said? I said, class of 2024, don't you ever let anyone write your story for you. Pick up the pen, pick up the notebook, and tell the truth, even if your hands are shaking. Especially if your hands are shaking. Because shaking hands still hold pens, and voices that tremble still tell truths. The funny part is, I don't feel like I changed all that much. I'm still Rachel Whitaker. I still plant marigolds, still make peach cobbler too sweet for anyone but Emily. But what's changed is the way I see myself. I'm not invisible anymore. I was never invisible, not really. They just tried to make me believe I was. And that's the lesson I'll leave you with tonight. If you're listening from your car or your kitchen or lying in bed with the lights off, remember this. The world will try to hand you bleach rags when you deserve balance sheets. They'll try to hand you silence when you've got truth burning in your throat. They'll underestimate you because it makes them feel taller. But you've got something they don't. You've got the power to pick up your own notebook and write it down. And one day, when the time comes, you'll carry that truth into whatever room it needs to be heard. And when you do, don't be surprised if the very people who doubted you are the first to clap. I never asked for applause, but I learned how to stand tall enough that when it finally came, I didn't need it. Harold's ledger sits on the shelf now beside my notebooks, side by side, past and present. Proof that truth has a way of outliving lies. And when Lily asks again one day, Grandma, how did you do it? I'll tell her the simplest thing I know. I didn't let them destroy me. I didn't let them destroy what mattered. And neither will you. So maybe this isn't an ending after all. Maybe it's just the next ripple moving out into the pond, touching shores I'll never see. And if you're listening tonight, maybe you'll take that ripple and make your own. Because legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about reminding someone else they were never invisible in the first place. Now tell me what's the story you'll write for yourself.